There are moments in life when a person feels the quiet weight of an old question pressing gently against the back of the mind, something that lingers for years without ever demanding an answer, yet always returning in the stillness between one breath and the next. It is the question of why some people choose a life so radically different from the one everyone else calls normal. Why a man would walk away from roads and routines, from comforts and company, and instead climb toward the cold silence of the mountains with nothing more than a pack, a purpose, and a kind of patience the world rarely understands. As you listen to this story, you might discover a piece of yourself inside it, because even if you have never set foot on a snowy trail or felt your lungs burn in the thin air of the high ridges, you know what it is like to search for meaning beyond the noise. You know the desire to breathe a little deeper, to find a place where your thoughts settle, where life feels honest again. Maybe you have carried that desire quietly for a long time, tracing its edges in your mind every time the world felt too fast, too crowded, or too demanding. The man who lived alone in the mountains understood that feeling well. Long before the villagers mocked him, long before anyone heard of the ice chimney that warmed his cabin without a single spark of firewood, he was just a solitary figure walking north with the calm confidence of someone who had finally listened to his own heart. He had no intention of impressing anyone and certainly no interest in proving people wrong. He simply knew that the mountains offered something the rest of the world could not. A steady silence that wrapped around him like a second skin, a sense of belonging that asked for nothing and returned everything. Up there, he could hear the wind speak through the treetops. He could feel the weight of each snowfall as if it carried an old truth, and he could measure time not by hours or appointments, but by the slow drifting of clouds and the quiet rhythm of his own breath. This kind of life is not madness, though many say it is. It is a choice made not out of desperation, but out of clarity, a rare kind of clarity that most people never grant themselves the space to find. But people talk. They always do. And in the small village at the foot of the range, the stories grew like weeds. Some claimed he had lost his mind. Others said solitude had turned him strange, and a few believed he was running from something unspeakable. They laughed when he hauled blocks of ice up the slope, hour after hour, day after day. They shook their heads as he carved tunnels and chambers through the snowdrifts near his cabin, insisting it was a fool's project, a pointless obsession. They called it his crazy ice chimney, mocking both the name and the man who built it. What they did not understand was that he heard their laughter and felt no sting from it. Their opinions were the wind at his back, passing by without altering his pace. To him, the laughter was a sign of how far he had climbed away from their world and how close he was to living exactly as he wished. When he first arrived on the mountain, he carried only what he needed: a pot, a knife, a bedroll, a handful of tools, and a deep familiarity with silence. He spent the early days learning the rhythm of the land, clearing the old cabin that had been left to rot beneath decades of storms, cutting paths through the snow, listening to the ground as if it might tell him where to place each stone. The cold did not frighten him. It reminded him that he was alive. The wind did not discourage him. It sharpened his senses and taught him patience. Even the darkness of the long winter nights felt like a companion rather than a threat. He would sit beside the frost-coated window, watching the faint glow of the stars, feeling a calm certainty settle over him. The mountain was not an escape. It was a return to something essential, something he had once felt as a child before life had become tangled and heavy. The idea for the ice chimney came early, not as a grand invention, but as an instinctive puzzle. The cabin stood strong, yet the cold crept in through every crack. Firewood was scarce on that ridge, and gathering it burned precious energy. He could have moved further down, closer to the tree line, but he did not want to. He liked the height, the way the northern winds swept across the ridge and cleared the snow in long, elegant waves. He liked the solitude that only the upper runs of the mountain could offer. So instead of changing his home, he chose to change the way he lived inside it. Every person who chooses a life of solitude knows how to observe the world with uncommon attention, and he began noticing something others never would have seen. The way ice formed layers against the cabin wall suggested that the mountain itself created currents of warm and cold air that twisted gently around the ridge. If he could guide those currents, if he could shape them with tunnels of packed snow and hollowed ice columns, he might be able to pull warm air toward the cabin without burning a single log. So he started experimenting, not with haste or frustration, but with the calm curiosity of someone who understands that nature is a patient teacher. He carved narrow passages through the ice banks and watched how the air traveled. He stacked blocks of frozen snow like bricks, shaping them with the blade of his knife until each one fit perfectly against the next. The villagers, whenever they caught sight of him from below, laughed louder. They said he had lost his grip on reality. They said the cold had cracked his mind. They said anyone who built chimneys out of ice deserved the misery that would follow. But the man simply continued working, acknowledging the mountain rather than the voices rising from the valley. And perhaps this is where you might find your own reflection in his story. Because maybe you too have faced moments when others questioned your path, when you felt pulled toward something unusual, something misunderstood, something that didn't fit neatly into the expectations people placed upon you. And perhaps you hesitated, not because your heart doubted the direction, but because the noise around you grew too loud. The man on the mountain lived without that hesitation. He had once felt it long ago, but the mountain taught him to let it go. Up here, he understood that life becomes clearer when you stop measuring your choices by the understanding of others. As he continued to shape the ice chimney, he learned the mountain in ever deeper ways. Every shift in the wind, every change in temperature, every whisper of movement in the snow beneath his boots carried meaning. He began rising before dawn, letting the pale blue light guide his hands as he carved. Some days the cold bit into his skin until it felt like stone, yet he smiled through it because he knew he was building something that belonged entirely to this place, something created from the mountain itself. The cold was not an enemy, it was a collaborator, and though the villagers mocked him, he carried no resentment. He believed that each person must live according to their own truths, and their truth was different from his. When the first warm draft finally slid into the cabin through the ice chimney, he understood that the mountain had accepted his effort. It was not a burst of heat or a dramatic wave of warmth. It was subtle, a gentle shift that raised the temperature just enough to soften the air. But that softening meant everything. It meant that the deep winter nights no longer pressed against his bones. It meant that he could rest without waking every few hours to add wood to the fire. It meant that the cabin became a living space rather than a shelter carved out of necessity. It meant that he had discovered a way to survive the coldest storms without exhausting the limited resources around him. And more than anything, it meant that he had trusted his instinct and the mountain had responded. I tell you this because I know that somewhere inside you there is a quiet longing for a life that feels more honest, more grounded, more connected to something real. We all carry that longing, though only a few of us ever dare to act on it. As you imagine this man shaping a chimney of ice while laughter rose from the village below, maybe you can feel the faint echo of your own dreams, the ones you set aside, because someone once told you they were impossible or strange. This story is not just about the mountain or the chimney or the cold. It is about the courage to listen to yourself, even when others refuse to understand. And before we walk further into his life, before we uncover the past that led him to this solitude and the reasons he chose to remain in the silence of the mountain, I want to ask you something as naturally as the wind brushing the ridge. Tell me from where you are listening to this story, because each place carries its own mountains, its own silences, its own quiet truths waiting to be remembered. Before the mountain, there had been another life, though he rarely spoke of it and thought of it only when the snow softened his memories. It was a life of movement without meaning, of endless conversations that led nowhere, of faces that smiled politely while their eyes stayed distant and restless. In the town where he was born, the air always felt too heavy, thick with the smoke of factories and the hum of electricity that never seemed to rest. People hurried through the streets like they were being chased by invisible hands. They talked about success, about progress, about the future, yet no one ever seemed to arrive anywhere. He worked among them for years, doing what he was told, earning enough to survive, but never enough to feel free. Each day felt like a repetition of the last. Every night, like a quiet rehearsal for another morning that would look exactly the same. He did not hate that life, but he could not love it either. It was as though he had been born into a song whose rhythm never matched his own heartbeat. He remembered the moment when he realized he had to leave. It was not dramatic or sudden. It came one gray morning when the city lights still glowed faintly against the fog, and he found himself watching the people cross the street below his window. They moved as though they were part of a silent machine, their gestures mechanical, their faces drained of wonder. In that instant, he saw his own reflection among them, and it frightened him. He saw a man who had forgotten how to listen to the wind, who had not seen a sunrise without glass between him and the world in many years, who had become efficient but not alive. That morning, he packed a small bag, left his apartment key on the table, and walked toward the edge of town. He did not leave a note. He did not call anyone. He simply stepped into the road that led toward the mountains, drawn not by logic, but by something older and quieter within him, something that whispered that he would never find peace until he stood again among the stones and the sky. The journey took weeks. He walked during the day and slept beside rivers or beneath the shelter of trees. The further he went, the lighter he felt. He could almost hear the layers of noise peeling away from his thoughts. The first nights were uneasy. He had forgotten the language of silence. Every creak of branches, every flutter of wings startled him awake. But as the days passed, he began to understand that the forest was not an enemy, but a teacher. The sound of the wind became familiar. The rhythm of his footsteps grew steady, and by the time he reached the base of the mountain, he was no longer a man escaping the world, but a man returning to himself. At the foot of the mountain stood a small village. He stayed there for a short while, repairing fences and helping with small chores to earn food and tools. The villagers were kind at first, curious about the stranger, who spoke little and smiled often. They offered him a place to stay, but he refused politely. He spent most of his evenings sitting outside watching the sun disappear behind the peaks, feeling something stir within him each time the light faded. When he asked about the old cabin near the northern ridge, they laughed and told him no one lived there any more, that it was half buried in snow, its roof sagging, its walls splitting apart. But he listened not to their warnings, but to the quiet certainty in his chest that told him the place was waiting for him. The next morning he set out, carrying what little he owned and leaving behind the comfort of the village. The first days were hard. The path was steep and the snow deep, and he had not yet learned how to read the signs of the mountain. He made mistakes, small ones at first, but the mountain teaches through discomfort. His hands bled, his breath burned, and his body ached. Yet, with every step he felt himself shed another piece of the man he had been. When he finally reached the cabin, it stood crooked and half swallowed by drifts. But there was beauty in its ruin. He cleared the snow from the roof, patched the cracks with moss and clay, and made it livable again. That first night he lay awake, listening to the storm howling outside, and instead of fear, he felt a deep calm. For the first time in years, the sound he heard was not the buzz of machines or the chatter of voices, but the raw music of nature itself. In the days that followed, he began to learn the ways of the mountain. He watched how the snow settled, how the wind shifted through the valleys, how the sunlight fell differently depending on the hour. He discovered that solitude was not loneliness. It was an invitation to notice everything he had ignored before. The crack of frozen branches became a language. The silence between gusts of wind became a kind of prayer. Each task, chopping wood, melting snow for water, mending a wall, became a meditation. He stopped measuring time by clocks and began measuring it by the length of shadows and the scent of the air. He discovered that the mountain did not care who he had been, what he had achieved, or what others thought of him. It only cared that he listened, that he respected its rhythm, that he lived honestly within its rules. The villagers came to visit him from time to time, bringing food or news from below. They thought of him as harmless, perhaps a little strange. But as the winters passed and he did not return, their curiosity turned to gossip. They could not understand why anyone would choose a life so cold and quiet. They asked him if he was lonely. He smiled and said that loneliness only exists when one forgets how to be present. They asked if he missed people. He said he still saw people, only differently. Now they came to him as clouds, as rivers, as the slow patience of stones. The villagers did not know how to answer that. They left, shaking their heads, whispering that he must be half mad. But the truth was simpler. He had not fled the world because of hatred or pain. He had left because the noise had drowned out his ability to hear himself. The mountain gave him back that voice. It reminded him that every man is born with an inner compass, but most stop following it as soon as they learn to listen to everyone else instead. Up there, surrounded by wind and ice, he learned that peace is not found in comfort, but in clarity. It comes when you strip life down to its bare elements and discover that even in the silence, you are never truly alone. The mountain speaks through everything, through the crunch of your boots, through the hum of the wind, through the stillness that fills your lungs. Sometimes, in the long evenings when the snow fell so thick that the world outside vanished, he would think of the people below and feel a kind of gentle sadness, not because he missed them, but because he wished they could understand that freedom is not something to be found. It is something to be remembered. The world had taught them to chase it endlessly, to buy it, to plan for it, to seek it in things. But here, on the mountain, he saw that freedom had always been with him, quiet and patient, waiting for him to stop running. When he looked into the mirror of the frozen lake, he saw not a hermit or an exile, but a man who had finally become simple enough to belong. He never returned to the town. The longer he stayed on the mountain, the less the past mattered. The people who once knew him faded into stories. The sounds of the city became distant memories, like dreams slipping away in the morning light. The mountain gave him new meaning in their place. Each day he woke to the silence, built his fire, checked his traps, watched the sky change its colors, and felt grateful. He no longer needed to ask why he was there. The question had dissolved into the snow, leaving only the answer of being. And perhaps that is what he would tell you if you were to sit across from him by the small wooden table in his cabin, while the wind rattled gently outside. He would tell you that the world is full of people who live surrounded by others and yet feel utterly alone, and that solitude, when chosen with love, is not a punishment, but a path. He would tell you that every person should find their mountain, not necessarily one of rock and ice, but one of silence and honesty, where they can finally hear themselves again. If you have ever felt that call, that faint whisper to step away from the noise, to rediscover your own rhythm, then maybe you already understand a part of his journey. And as his story unfolds, I invite you to stay with it, to listen, not just with your ears, but with that quiet place inside you that still remembers what peace feels like. Because in the end, his story is not just his. It belongs to anyone who has ever looked at the horizon and felt the pull of something deeper. And if these words have already stirred something within you, then perhaps it is time to walk with him a little further. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe so you can follow the rest of his journey through the mountains and beyond, and let his story remind you of the power of stillness. There came a time when the mountain no longer felt like a place he had moved to, but rather the shape of his own being. The days and nights merged into a quiet continuity, the kind that does not need clocks or calendars to define its flow. Each morning began with the same ritual, simple and deliberate. He would wake before the first light, when the world was still wrapped in a bluish mist, and listen. It was his way of greeting the mountain, The sound of the wind, the subtle groan of the ice, the soft rustle of snow shifting under its own weight, all of it spoke to him in a language that no human tongue could reproduce. He believed that this silence, this vast, quiet presence that filled the valleys and ridges, was the closest thing to truth he had ever known. Silence was not emptiness to him, it was fullness, as if every particle of air carried a memory of the earth's beginning. He learned that silence could be a companion more faithful than any friend. It never judged, never demanded, never interrupted. It simply existed beside him, shaping his thoughts and sharpening his senses. When you live long enough in such quiet, the mind stops reaching outward for distraction and begins turning inward toward understanding. The man discovered things about himself that he could never have known amid the noise of the world. He realized that most of what people call loneliness is merely the discomfort of facing their own reflection without the background chatter that usually hides it. Up there, with only the wind and the snow as witnesses, he faced that reflection every day until it ceased to frighten him. The silence became a mirror that showed him not who he wished to be, but who he truly was. His days were made of small labors, yet none felt small. He repaired the roof after each storm, fetched water from the stream that froze solid at night, and tended to the modest garden he built during the warmer months. He cooked simple meals, roots, dried meat, berries when the season allowed, and ate them slowly, savoring not the taste, but the act of being nourished. Every task carried meaning because it was done with full attention. There was no rush, no schedule pressing him forward. When the sun rose, he worked. When it set, he rested. It was the most natural rhythm imaginable, one that humans had followed for centuries before forgetting. Sometimes he would walk to the ridge above his cabin and sit for hours watching the world stretch beneath him. From that height, the village below looked like a cluster of toy houses pressed into the earth. Smoke rose lazily from their chimneys, drifting away like thoughts dissolving into the air. He wondered if they ever looked up toward the mountains and thought of him, the strange man who had chosen solitude. He hoped they did, not out of pride, but because he wished that at least one of them might understand that peace is not found in what you possess, but in what you are willing to let go of. The world below was full of noise and haste, of people running after things that slipped from their grasp the moment they caught them. Up here, he had nothing, and yet he lacked nothing. Winter was the hardest and most beautiful season. It tested his strength, his patience, and his will to remain calm under pressure. When the snow piled high against the door, he would carve tunnels through it with steady hands. When the wind howled so fiercely that the cabin shook, he would wrap himself in blankets and listen as though it were an ancient song meant only for him. He came to understand that every storm, no matter how violent, eventually passed, leaving behind a deeper silence and a clearer sky. He compared it to the storms inside people's minds, loud, terrifying, but temporary. The key was not to fight them, but to endure them with quiet dignity. He also noticed how the silence changed from season to season. In summer, it was soft, filled with the hum of insects and the trickle of melting snow. In autumn, it deepened, carrying the dry whisper of fallen leaves. In winter, it grew vast and pure, a sound so complete that even his own heartbeat seemed a disturbance within it. He came to love each variation as if it were a different mood of the same being. The mountain was alive, not just in its trees and rivers, but in its stillness. It breathed with him. Sometimes, when the night sky burned with cold stars, he felt that his own breathing had synchronized with that of the earth, that for a brief moment he was no longer separate from anything. There were moments of difficulty, of course, days when the cold sank so deep into his bones that it took hours to warm again, nights when hunger gnawed at his belly and the wind tore at his roof. But even those moments carried a strange satisfaction. Pain, he realized, is not the enemy people think it is. It is a teacher, a sharp one, but a necessary one. It reminds you that you are still alive, still part of the great cycle that binds everything together. When he felt the sting of frostbite or the ache of exhaustion, he did not curse it. He accepted it as part of the exchange. The mountain gave him peace, and in return, he offered his endurance. Over time, animals began to visit his cabin. A fox appeared one winter morning, thin and cautious, watching him from the edge of the clearing. He left a piece of dried meat on the snow and turned away. The next day, the meat was gone. A week later, the fox returned with a steadier gaze. A small bird began nesting under the eaves, singing its fragile song at dawn. These small encounters filled him with quiet joy. They reminded him that even in solitude, he was not alone. The creatures of the mountain accepted him not as an intruder, but as another form of life moving within their world. He learned from them the patience of the fox, the precision of the bird, the calm endurance of the deer that passed through the valley each dusk. He kept no calendar, but the years marked themselves through the changes in his beard, the deepening of lines around his eyes, and the softening of his heart. Age did not frighten him. To him, it was simply the mountain's way of carving its presence into his face. Sometimes he would look at his reflection in a piece of still water and smile. He saw not the man he had been, nor the one the villagers remembered, but a new being shaped entirely by wind, snow, and silence. And in that silence, he found clarity about the world he had left behind. He understood that people fill their lives with noise because they are afraid of what they might hear in the quiet. They build walls of sound, of conversation, of constant motion to avoid the truth that silence reveals, that life is fleeting, fragile, and infinitely precious. In the city, people talk endlessly about freedom while chaining themselves to comfort and convenience. Up here, he had discovered the kind of freedom that does not depend on anything external. It was the freedom of breathing deeply, of waking each morning with purpose, of feeling part of something vast and eternal. He began writing sometimes, though not for anyone to read. Small notes carved into wood, words scratched into flat stones, lines etched in the margins of his old journal. They were not stories or records, just reflections, fragments of thought left to drift in the wind. He knew they would fade, but that was the point. Everything fades. The act of writing them was enough. It was a way of thanking the silence for all it had taught him. As the winters passed, the villagers' laughter turned to curiosity again. They noticed smoke rising regularly from his cabin, and word spread that he had found a way to stay warm without using wood. Some came up to see for themselves. They found him calm, kind, and strangely content, and though they still whispered about his ice chimney, Their tone had softened. They saw that he was not mad, only different. Different in a way that made them uneasy because it reminded them of what they had lost. And if you, listening now, have ever dreamed of escaping the weight of constant noise, of stepping into a life where time feels like it breathes instead of runs, then you already understand him. Silence is not an absence. It is the beginning of everything that truly matters. It is the space where thought becomes understanding, where fear becomes acceptance, and where loneliness transforms into peace. His life had become a rhythm of breath and snow, of wind and waiting. And though the villagers would never fully understand, he knew that what he had found could not be explained. It could only be lived. The challenge came not with a roar, but with a whisper, as most true challenges do. It began one late winter when the cold grew heavier than in any year before, a deep and relentless frost that seemed to freeze even the breath inside his lungs. The mountain, which had always been stern but fair, turned suddenly harsh and unpredictable. The storms no longer passed quickly. They lingered for days, wrapping the peaks in a shroud of white that erased every familiar landmark. The man woke each morning to a world remade, every path he knew swallowed by snow. The air was so dry it stung his throat when he breathed, and the smallest task became an effort of will. He had faced many winters, but this one felt different, older, heavier, almost alive in its determination to test him. He began to notice strange sounds in the night, not the usual creak of ice or the sigh of wind, but a deep rumble that seemed to move through the ground itself. The snow shifted in unnatural ways, sliding down slopes that had always been stable. It was as if the mountain were speaking in a language of warning. One evening, while checking the outer tunnels of his ice chimney, he saw a fracture running through the base of one of the columns. The air had grown colder than ever, and the ice had hardened to a glass-like brittleness. If it broke, the warm current that kept his cabin alive would be lost, and rebuilding it in such weather would be nearly impossible. For 2 days he worked without rest. His hands cracked from the cold, his breath came in shallow bursts, and the ice cut into his skin as he carved and reinforced the structure. Snow fell endlessly, blinding him, but he kept going, guided by instinct more than sight. At one point, the tunnel collapsed behind him, sealing the path back to the cabin. He was trapped in a cocoon of blue light and silence so deep it felt like the heart of the earth. For a moment, he thought of death, not with fear, but with an odd serenity. He knew that if this was where his life ended, it would be in the place he had chosen, doing the work he loved. But something inside him refused to stop. He pressed his hands against the wall of ice and began to dig, carving slowly upward, trusting that the mountain would show him the way. Hours passed, though he could no longer tell how many. His limbs grew heavy, his heartbeat slowed, and the air thinned until every breath felt like pulling smoke through water. Then, suddenly, a faint glow appeared above him. He dug toward it, the last strength in his arms driving the knife through the ice. When the blade broke through and the first rush of cold air struck his face, he felt an overwhelming flood of gratitude. He pulled himself through the opening and lay there on the snow, staring at the stars that had returned after the storm. The sky looked impossibly wide, a black ocean of silence stretching forever. The mountain had tested him, and he had answered with faith. The days that followed were marked by quiet recovery. He patched the chimney, mended the tunnels, and rested his body. The warmth returned, flowing once again through the passage of ice that the villagers still mocked. But as he sat beside the soft glow of his small lamp, he realized something profound. The chimney had not only brought heat, it had revealed balance. The ice, the air, and the mountain's breath were not separate forces. They were parts of one living system, each sustaining the other. The warmth that flowed into his home was not something he had created, but something he had learned to cooperate with. Nature had always provided. Man only needed to listen well enough to understand how to live within it. In that realization, he saw the folly of his former life. Down in the world below, people built their comfort by force, by conquering nature rather than learning from it. They dug into the earth, burned its ancient remains, and filled the air with their exhaust, believing themselves masters of their surroundings. Up here, he had built something out of what already existed, using cold to create warmth, silence to generate peace, simplicity to find abundance. The irony was almost too perfect. What the villagers had laughed at as madness was in truth a form of harmony they had long forgotten. Word of his strange invention eventually spread further. Travelers passing through the valley spoke of the man who heated his cabin with an ice chimney. Some came to see it with their own eyes. They found a quiet figure standing beside his home, welcoming them without pride or secrecy. He showed them how the tunnels worked, how the flow of warm and cold air intertwined, how the structure sustained itself without fire. Most of them nodded politely, not fully understanding. They wanted to believe in something miraculous, but he told them there was no miracle, only patience, observation, and respect for the balance of things. When they left, they carried the story back to the world below, and slowly the laughter faded. Still, the true discovery was not the chimney itself, but what it revealed within him. During those long hours inside the frozen tunnel, facing the silence of death, he had felt something awaken, a deep understanding that the mountain was not his opponent, but his reflection. Every hardship mirrored something within him, every storm a storm of his own making, every thaw a moment of forgiveness. The ice chimney was a symbol of that truth. It was born not from cleverness or defiance, but from the willingness to learn from what others called impossible. In learning to shape ice into warmth, he had learned to shape fear into faith. As spring came and the snow began to melt, he stood outside the cabin watching streams of water run down the slopes. The mountain softened, revealing its hidden colors: gray stone, moss, the tender green of grass breaking through. The air smelled of earth again. Birds returned, calling across the valleys. In that renewal, he saw life's rhythm laid bare: struggle and rest, death and rebirth, cold and warmth, silence and song. Everything had its place, and he too had found his. One morning, a young man from the village climbed the path to visit him. He had heard of the ice chimney and wanted to learn how it worked. The hermit welcomed him, offering tea made from dried herbs gathered on the ridge. Together they sat outside the cabin while the mist lifted from the valley. The young man asked question after question, fascinated not only by the chimney, but by the quiet confidence of the man who had built it. Finally, he asked why he had chosen such a life. The hermit smiled and said that once you learn to listen to silence, the noise of the world becomes unbearable. The young man nodded slowly, though he did not yet understand. Understanding, the hermit knew, would come only when the noise within the young man grew too heavy to bear. When the visitor left, the hermit watched him descend the trail and felt a quiet satisfaction. The mountain had begun to teach others through him. Perhaps one day that young man would return, or perhaps he would tell others that peace could be found not in comfort, but in clarity. Either way, the lesson would travel farther than any echo from the ridge. The days grew warmer, and the ice chimney began to glisten under the sun. It stood like a crystal tower beside the cabin, shimmering with hues of blue and white, a monument not to invention, but to understanding. Each time he looked at it, he felt gratitude rather than pride. Gratitude that he had survived, that he had listened, that he had found a way to live in harmony with what others feared. He often thought that perhaps the greatest discovery a man could make was not how to change the world, but how to stop fighting against it. He lived that summer in quiet abundance. His garden flourished, the river ran strong, and the air filled with the scent of pine. He wrote less, spoke less, and smiled more. The silence had deepened into something sacred. He knew the next winter would come, as all things do. But he no longer worried. He trusted the mountain now as one trusts an old friend whose harshness hides wisdom. And maybe this is what life always tries to teach us, that challenges are not punishments, but invitations. Each difficulty, each loss, each storm is a chance to uncover a truth that comfort keeps hidden. The man of the mountain had accepted that invitation fully, and in doing so, he had found the kind of peace that no wealth or company could offer. If you have listened this far, perhaps you already feel a quiet pull toward your own mountain, whatever it may be. Maybe you have faced your own storms and are still searching for warmth in the cold. Remember that every challenge carries a lesson, and every discovery begins when you choose to face it rather than flee from it. And if this story has stirred something within you, if you want to follow the rest of his journey and the wisdom hidden in these peaks, make sure you subscribe so you can walk beside him through the next paths of silence and reflection. The mountain still has much to teach. As years passed, the man found himself thinking less about survival and more about the world beyond the ridges. The mountain had given him everything he needed: food, shelter, silence, and a kind of wisdom that only time and solitude could distill. Yet every now and then, when the wind came from the south carrying faint smells of wood smoke and distant towns, memories of the world below drifted back into his mind. He would pause in his work, listen to the faint echoes of human life carried on the air, and feel something hard to name. It was not longing nor regret. It was closer to compassion, a quiet understanding of how lost people had become in their search for meaning. He realized that the greatest illusion of the world was not its noise or its speed, but its conviction that more is always better. People believed that peace could be built out of accumulation, that happiness was something that waited on the other side of effort. Down there, they spoke of freedom, but chained themselves to comfort. They spoke of purpose, but buried it beneath endless distraction. In their hunger to possess, they forgot how to simply be. Up here, he had learned that the richest life was the one stripped of excess, where every act, every breath, every sip of water carried the weight of gratitude. The mountain had taught him what no book or teacher ever could. That simplicity is not poverty, but power. He thought often of the villagers. He remembered how they once laughed at him, calling him a fool for building an ice chimney and living among storms. But in time, their laughter had softened into curiosity, and curiosity had turned into respect. Some of them climbed the trail now and then, bringing bread or news from the valley. They no longer asked him why he stayed. They had begun to understand that there are answers only silence can give. They listened as he spoke quietly about patience, about the way the snow always melts when it is ready, about how the cold teaches endurance and the sun teaches gratitude. They returned home changed, though few could explain how. He came to see that isolation had not separated him from humanity, but brought him closer to its essence. The mountain was not an escape from people. It was a mirror reflecting what people truly were beneath their illusions. Every fear he had faced here, the cold, the hunger, the loneliness, were the same fears that people face below, only disguised beneath comfort and noise. Up here they appeared in their pure form, naked and honest. In facing them, he had discovered that fear itself was not his enemy. It was simply the edge of understanding. Every time he stepped beyond that edge, the world grew larger and he grew smaller in the best possible way. He thought often about time. In the world below, people feared it, measured it, chased it. They filled their days with calendars and alarms, believing that to control time was to control life. But on the mountain, time did not move in lines or numbers. It moved in cycles, the slow turning of seasons, the melting and freezing of streams, the birth and decay of forests. Time here was not something to conquer, but something to belong to. When he watched the shadows slide across the valley, when he heard the first bird call in spring or the last one fade before winter, he felt part of that endless rhythm. He no longer aged, he simply changed, as the mountain did, as everything living must. There were moments when he thought about returning, not because he missed the world, but because he wondered if his silence could somehow help it. He imagined walking into the town again, seeing the faces of people rushing through their days and telling them what he had learned, that happiness is not something to chase, but something to allow. But he knew his words would sound strange there, as strange as his ice chimney once did. Wisdom, he had learned, is not something you can give. It must be discovered often painfully in the quiet corners of one's own life. So he stayed, not out of fear of the world, but out of respect for the truth that silence had revealed. In the evenings, when the sky blazed with the colors of dusk, he would sit outside his cabin and watch the sun dip behind the peaks. The air would cool, the shadows lengthen, and a kind of sacred hush would fall over everything. Those were the hours when his thoughts felt most open. He would remember faces from his past, friends, family, perhaps even love. But they came to him not with pain or nostalgia, only gratitude. Each one had led him here in some small way. He understood now that no path is wasted, no loss meaningless. The mountain had taught him to see life not as a chain of separate events, but as one long conversation between the soul and the world. Sometimes he wondered what people would remember of him when he was gone. Perhaps only the story of a strange man who built a chimney of ice and lived alone in the snow. But that did not matter. Legacy, he knew, was not about names or monuments. It was about the quiet traces one leaves behind, the kindness shown, the understanding shared, the example set. The mountain itself was his witness. It had seen him arrive as a man burdened by noise and become one shaped entirely by silence. And that was enough. He also began to reflect on what it meant to be human. The villagers often said he had become more mountain than man, but he smiled at that. To him, being human did not mean being separate from nature. It meant recognizing that one's mind, body, and breath were all extensions of it. The same water that froze in his chimney flowed in his veins. The same air that howled over the peaks filled his lungs. Humanity's tragedy, he realized, was its belief in separation. People had forgotten that the world was not something to own, but something to belong to. Up here, belonging came naturally, not as an idea, but as a lived truth. On rare nights, when the sky shimmered with the northern lights, he felt a sense of awe so immense it was almost unbearable. The colors rippled and danced above the peaks like living fire, and in those moments he understood that existence itself was the miracle everyone sought. Life did not need to be improved or explained. It only needed to be witnessed with open eyes. He often thought that if every person could spend just one night under that sky in absolute stillness, they would return home forever changed. They would stop rushing. They would start listening. He came to think of his life as a bridge between what the world had become and what it had forgotten. He had not abandoned humanity. He had gone ahead of it, walking into silence so he could remember what the noise had erased. His story was not one of escape, but of return, not to society, but to truth. Every time he looked at the ice chimney, still standing strong after so many winters, he saw not his own ingenuity, but nature's mercy. It reminded him that the world does not reward force. It rewards harmony. There were nights when he spoke aloud, not to anyone in particular, but to the wind itself. He would thank it for the lessons, for the patience it had shown, for the way it had stripped him bare until only the essential remained. He would thank the cold for its honesty, the storms for their clarity, the silence for its kindness. Gratitude had become his prayer, his only form of worship. And perhaps that is what he would tell you now, if you were standing beside him at the edge of the ridge. He would tell you that peace is not found by seeking comfort, but by seeking truth. And truth is often uncomfortable at first. He would tell you that you do not need to climb a mountain to find silence. You need only the courage to stop running from yourself. He would tell you that the world's noise is not the enemy. It is the teacher that shows you how precious quiet really is. As the moon rose over the peaks and cast its silver light on the snow, the man felt no difference between himself and the landscape. He was the breath in the cold, the pulse in the mountain, the spark in the ice. And for the first time, he understood that he had not simply found peace, he had become it. And if, while listening to his story, you have felt even a hint of that stillness within you, then take it with you. Let it remind you to pause, to breathe, to listen. And if you wish to keep walking beside him, to keep exploring these hidden truths of the mountain and the soul, subscribe so that his voice may continue guiding you through the silence that waits beyond the noise. The mountain does not keep time the way men do. It does not measure years or count seasons. It simply endures, shifting and breathing in ways so slow that only those who live long enough in its silence can sense its rhythm. The man had become part of that rhythm. His beard had turned white, his hands had grown thin, and his eyes, once sharp as ice, now carried the softness of a twilight sky. Yet his spirit was lighter than ever. The world below had aged without him, but he had aged with the mountain, and that made all the difference. Each wrinkle on his face felt carved by wind and snow, not by worry. Each scar on his hands was a testament not to struggle, but to learning. The winters no longer frightened him. He welcomed them as old companions. The storms that once howled against his cabin now sounded like familiar songs. He had learned to read the mountain's moods as one reads the expressions of a friend. When the clouds gathered low and heavy, he knew to stay close to the hearth. When the wind shifted north, he understood that snow would fall soon. When the fox disappeared from the clearing, he prepared for deep cold. Everything had meaning. Everything spoke. And he had learned to listen with a patience few ever achieve. One morning, as the first light touched the ice chimney, he noticed how the frost shimmered like silver veins. The air was still, perfectly calm, and in that stillness he heard something new, a silence deeper than any before, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. It was then he understood that his time here was nearing its end, not as a tragedy, but as a natural part of the same cycle he had lived by for so long. Death, to him, was not a shadow waiting at the edge of life. It was a doorway into the same stillness that had always surrounded him. He spent that day tending to small things. He mended a crack in the cabin wall, gathered what food he had left, and wrote a few final notes in his journal, not words of regret or farewell, but observations. The way the light hit the snow, the sound of water dripping from the roof, the faint hum of wind passing through the ice. He wanted to leave traces of what the mountain had taught him, not in grand ideas, but in small truths that others could feel. He knew that someday someone might find this place and read those lines, and perhaps understand that solitude is not emptiness, but fullness in its purest form. As the day faded into night, he sat by the window, watching the stars emerge one by one. Their light seemed softer now, closer, as though the sky itself had bent down to greet him. He thought about the people he had met, the villagers who once mocked him, the travelers who came in curiosity, the young man who had listened to his words. He wondered where they were now, what they had become. Maybe they had forgotten him entirely, maybe not. It did not matter. What mattered was that the lesson had begun to travel, carried not by his voice, but by the silence he had left in others. Outside, the mountain glowed under the moonlight. The ice chimney stood tall, a monument to the harmony between human effort and nature's wisdom. It no longer seemed like something he had built. It seemed as though the mountain itself had grown it, using his hands as tools. It still drew warm air into the cabin, still breathed life through the cold. In that moment, he realized that the chimney was more than an invention. It was a metaphor for everything he had learned. Warmth born from cold, comfort drawn from hardship, understanding shaped from silence. He lay down on his small bed and listened. The cabin creaked softly, the wind murmured outside, and his heartbeat slowed until it seemed to blend with the rhythm of the mountain. There was no fear, no sorrow, only the profound peace of belonging completely to the world that had shaped him. His final thought before drifting into sleep was not about the past or the future, but about the simplicity of the present, the breath he took, the air it filled, the stillness that received it. Days passed before the villagers noticed that the smoke no longer rose from the ridge. When they climbed the path to check on him, they found the cabin quiet, undisturbed. Inside, the fire had long gone out, but the air was still faintly warm. The man lay peacefully, his face calm, as if he had merely drifted into another kind of sleep. On the table beside him lay his journal, its pages filled with small, careful handwriting. The villagers read a few lines and fell silent. There were no grand declarations, no claims of wisdom, only reflections so simple and true that they felt like the voice of the mountain itself speaking through him. They buried him on a small rise above the cabin, where he could forever face the peaks he had loved. They marked the spot with a single stone, uncarved, as he would have wanted. The ice chimney still stood beside the cabin, glistening under the sun, continuing to breathe its quiet warmth into the empty home. Over time, the villagers began to visit not out of curiosity but reverence. They brought their children, telling them the story of the man who had turned ice into heat, who had found peace in solitude and wisdom in silence. The story spread beyond the valley. Travelers came to see the cabin, to touch the ice chimney, to feel for themselves the strange warmth that seemed to come not from the structure, but from the place itself. Some called it a miracle. Others called it science. But those who lingered long enough felt something deeper, a stillness that settled inside them, a sense of clarity they could not explain. Many left changed, quieter, more aware of the small sounds of the world. The man's legacy had become not his invention, but his example. Years turned into decades, and the mountain kept its watch. The cabin aged, the chimney melted and froze again with each season, and nature slowly folded his presence back into itself. But stories endure longer than stone, and the story of the man who listened to silence continued to be told. Some said his spirit still wandered the ridges, appearing on misty mornings as a faint figure walking along the horizon. Others said that when the wind blew in a certain way, you could hear his voice within it, calm and steady, reminding those who listened to breathe deeply and be still. In truth, he had never left. He lived on in the wind, in the snow, in the hearts of those who had been touched by the peace he embodied. His legacy was not something written or built, but something felt, a gentle whisper that taught people to see beauty where others saw hardship, to find warmth even in the coldest moments of their lives. And maybe that is the real lesson of his story, that happiness does not wait in distant places or in the approval of others. It lives quietly within you, waiting for you to listen. The mountain does not demand worship or fear. It asks only for attention. And when you give it that attention, when you slow down enough to hear its silence, you begin to hear yourself again. So wherever you are now, whether surrounded by noise or standing in stillness, remember the man who built warmth from ice. Remember that peace is not a destination, but a way of seeing. And when the world feels too loud, close your eyes for a moment and imagine the mountain, the snow, the endless quiet, and let it remind you of what is simple and true. If this story has touched something inside you, if it has brought even a moment of calm, let it continue its journey. Leave your thoughts below, share where you are listening from, and pass this story on to someone who might need its silence. Like it, share it, subscribe, and let these words carry the echo of the mountain's wisdom a little further into the world. Because peace, like warmth, spreads best when it is shared.